Thanks very much. Can everyone hear me okay? Got a whole bunch of people in the back, yes? Good. All right, I got a sound check from the back. Thank you very much. Mike, thank you for that introduction, and thanks for the opportunity to do this. It's a pleasure to be here. I'm afraid I don't know the students in the room, but maybe we'll get to know each other a little bit as this goes on today. But it's always a pleasure to work with social sciences, and it's always a pleasure to work with this event. And today, we're going to be talking about the civil rights movement. And a couple things about that talk before we jump right in. My view, as you'll see, is that the role of people in the making of any kind of history is central. And also, we're going to be talking about the movement as a multi-ethnic movement. Civil rights, of course, in the late 20th century was primarily about the position of African Americans in American society, but it is broader than that. And so hopefully you'll see that coming through as we move along. The first handful of slides have a lot of text as we talk and set the stage a little bit, but after that it's very visual. And I do want to let you know that some of the visuals as we move into the 1950s and 60s are a bit graphic. There was a lot of violence in and around the civil rights movement, and you're going to see some of that in this presentation. So be forewarned, that's coming. Okay? Thanks again for the opportunity. I want to talk a little bit with you first about history. Not just the civil rights movement, but about history. What is it? And I'm going to ask you to help me do that. Now, I spoke to this young woman right before we started. She's smiling and shaking her head. I said, "You're the bravest person in the room because you were the closest to me. You're sitting up front. That means I get to pick on you. What's your name?"
Diamond.
Diamond. Okay. In your opinion, Diamond, what is history? I know, just a little, okay? It's not so hard. What is history?
Events that happened in the past.
Okay. Events that happened in the past. Someone help Diamond out. That's good. It's a good start. What else?
I'm going to get you some volunteers.
That's a good idea. I can't quite move through the aisles here.
Well, I take it more literally. It's the story of a people,
Good.
of their culture, their religion,
Good.
everything.
Very good. Anyone want to add to that? This is a terrific start.
It's a continuous process, things that keep repeating.
Some we hope wouldn't repeat, but right. Absolutely.
What's to look forward to the future?
In a way, I think so, too. And my friend with the sound check in the back.
I'd say a lot of history is the interpretation of people who either, I hate to say won the war, but people who
Sometimes.
won the war to write history. So.
Okay, sometimes that's true. It's not always about war, but it's very often about conflict, one way or the other. How do we know what we know about history? Diamond, I'll leave you alone this time. You're a good sport. How do historians know what they know? How do you as students of history know what you know about history? Go ahead and tell me your name, please.
Aja.
Aja, okay.
Unfortunately, sometimes I think it's more we go with what we what people tell us.
Mm-hmm.
Especially, I know in elementary, the things I was taught then is not the same things I'm taught now in college.
Right.
And so what I look for is more of a credible source with historians.
Okay.
And more I know one of the, using primary documents,
Perfect.
Letters and not just what someone's take on what happened.
Absolutely. I'm sure you're all accustomed to using textbooks in your history classes, maybe monographs. All of those things that express what a historian knows or tries to know about history comes from exactly what you said. It comes from documents. And documents can be a lot of different things. They can be a letter written from one person to another. It can be an official government document like a piece of legislation or the Constitution. It can be photographs. Some historians are very creative, and they look to the natural environment for documents. Petrified wood can be a document. And so the list goes on and on. But analyzing those things, that's how we know what we know. And there are always going to be gaps in what we know. So a big part of history and how we know what we know is not just what occurred, but what we think of what we know probably occurred, we think. The point is, there's room for error, and there's room for interpretation. And when you listen to me, or when you listen to Professor Light, or when you read one of your history textbooks, you are getting perspective, not necessarily absolute truth. Historians spend a lot of time talking about how difficult it is to find absolute truth. Okay. I welcome you to Lerner's Law. History is all about people. And here it is in its most basic. Your history books are full of maps, quotes, documents, all kinds of things. We learned about, someone mentioned war before in the back there. All of those things are about what people do or don't do, about the choices they make or choose not to make. And it's about people as individuals building groups. And we'll hear a lot about that today as we talk about the civil rights movement. And the groups that they build, it's the things that they do. In the public world, in the private world, all of these things, it starts with people. And what you'll see as we move on and talk more about civil rights today is that people in the civil rights movement took enormous risks, sometimes with tragic consequences, because they were in pursuit of a goal. All right, so let's think very quickly about civil rights itself. Okay, I need another student volunteer that Professor Light will pick on. What are civil rights? Let me come up a little bit.
Tell us your name.
Ashley.
Okay, Ashley, okay.
Rights for people. I mean, what? I don't know how to explain it.
Try a for instance. Maybe that'll help. What's an example?
For instance, not just one color can sit on one side of the bus or one
There you
side
go.
of the bus.
Okay, very good. How about some other examples? What are civil rights?
Freedom of speech.
Freedom of speech, absolutely. What else?
I define civil rights as a civilian's rights to pursuit of life, liberty, and happiness.
Okay. All wonderful American traditions, of course. The U.S. government has given us a way to look at this. This is from the Department of Health and Human Services. Let me just put that up. And if you're really enterprising, when you're all done here, you can go to hhs.gov and read this for yourself and more. Civil rights, this is sort of, again, a formal governmental definition of what they are. But what I like about this are the examples. And some of you were starting to hit on that just now. Freedom of speech, the right to vote, which is huge, especially when we're talking about the civil rights movement. In our democracy, your access to vote is your ability to participate in the governing of your society. Due process of law, an entire amendment to the Constitution that speaks directly to this concept. It was passed in the middle of the 19th century. African Americans were not benefiting from it 100 years later, and of course that's what the civil rights movement is about. And so on, and so on, and so on. So, civil rights is all of these things, and maybe a bit more. We'll see as we move on. So here's the corollary to Lerner's law. Again, back to people. As a historian, I struggle to think of a better example. Maybe there is one. But I struggle to think of a better example than this of looking at the influence people can have in changing the course or defining the course of history. I think I've written it here as, yes, actively making history. History isn't just passive. It doesn't just occur. It's the product of what people choose to do or not do in the way that they interact with each other. Okay. As we poke into this, we have to think about the what, the where, and the when of the civil rights movement. So let's start with the what. We've got a little bit of a definition of civil rights going, but what was the movement itself? And I know many of you are in the African American history class. You haven't quite got to this point of the class, but I'll bet you know something about the movement despite that. Anyone, what was the movement? I'll leave you alone, I promise. Go ahead, please.
It was the struggle or the fight to secure those rights.
Yes, absolutely. And quite simply, the largest social movement in American history, period. The end of sentence. And it's a lot longer than maybe you think. Hopefully you picked up a timeline when you came in. You notice that has two halves. I started it at 1865. You can certainly make an argument that it goes back further than that. Okay. Where was the civil rights movement happening? Yeah, tell us your name too, please.
My name is Brianna.
Brianna, okay.
I believe it started in the South, like the southern states of America.
Yes, but it was everywhere. The civil rights movement was happening in one way or the other all over the United States in the middle of the 20th century, and certainly before then as well. The South, yes, the flashpoint for it in the 1940s, 50s, and 60s is the American South, because it's in those southern states, Mississippi, Alabama, Louisiana, so on and so on, where segregation was so ingrained, where you could have a state like the state of Mississippi that had an enormous African-American population, and only 6% were registered to vote in the early 1960s, because the state of Mississippi wouldn't allow them to vote. So yes, most of it is occurring in the South, but it's actually everywhere. There are race riots in California, in New Haven, Connecticut, all over the place. Okay, and I hinted at this a second ago. When was the Civil Rights Movement? I'll actually provide the answer to that one. Yeah. It's a long run, from the early 19th century to the late 20th century. Well, with what, where, and when, we also have to consider who. We'll get there in just a second. But first, take a quick look at the timeline of the movement. This is the handout I gave you. And because my laser pointer is kind of small, I'll use my hand. 1865 is the end of the Civil War. And within 5 years of the end of the Civil War, the Reconstruction Amendments, as we call them, were developed. Amendments 13, 14, and 15 to the U.S. Constitution. These are the amendments that abolished slavery, which had been in existence in North America since the early 17th century, early 1600s. 14th Amendment established due process of law, defined citizenship. And then the 15th Amendment secured voting rights. 100 years later, those things weren't being held. And that's what the Civil Rights Movement was largely about in the 50s and 60s. But as you can see, as it moves on, Reconstruction itself ends in the late 1870s. By the turn of the 20th century, race relations are so poor that there's a crisis in America around lynching of African Americans all over the United States, not just in the South. I won't read the rest of this to you. You've got it in front of you probably. But I want you to see that the first part runs into about the early 1950s. And then the second part, all those things, that's only 15 years, and that's a very short timeline. It's a short listing of events. We could add a lot more than that. But one of the ones that jumps out right away is 1954, a famous Supreme Court case, Brown versus the Board of Topeka, Kansas, in which the court ruled segregation of schools was not legal. A little bit more on that as we get there. And moving along to the famous lunch counter sit-ins in the early 1960s, the Voting Rights Act, or the Civil Rights Act and the Voting Rights Act, so on and so on and so on. Again, we're going to cover all of these things as we move on. And we're going to do it by looking at the who. Okay, who is this person? Martin Luther King, absolutely. Who is this person? Okay. The Civil Rights Movement was strongly influenced by these two people. But the Civil Rights Movement was influenced strongly by lots and lots of people whose names you may not know. Martin Luther King, Malcolm X, probably are the icons of the movement and of different threads within the movement. What was Martin Luther King known for? What was his approach to civil rights? Yeah, nonviolence, absolutely. And how about Malcolm X? Not exactly. I had a feeling you might say that. Not exactly violence. The famous phrase that Malcolm X had said was that change needed to come, quote, by any means necessary, whatever that means is. Could include violence. He meant self-defense. But the media certainly like to portray it as violence. The point is, you clearly do know who they are. You're going to learn about some more people today who you may not. Or we have to start all the way back in the 19th century. All the way back in the 19th century. This person is William Lloyd Garrison, and next to him are the Grimke sisters. They look very happy in front of the camera, all of them, as you can see, or in front of the artist, as the case may be. In the 1830s, Garrison, the man on the left, founded a newspaper called The Liberator, which was the touchstone for the movement for abolition. Abolition meaning movement to end slavery in the United States. The Grimke sisters were actually the daughters of a well-known slaveholding family in Charleston, South Carolina, who, despite being raised in that environment with every advantage a person could imagine, were outraged by slavery in American life. And they had a long public career as activists and authors trying to end slavery in the United States. There's a lot more people we could toss in here, and I didn't do that for the sake of time. But I wanted you to see these folks in particular because right away I want you to understand that early on the movement to end slavery and later for civil rights involves white people, black people, Hispanic people, Asian people, on and on and on and on. It really is a multi-ethnic movement. Okay. Anybody know this figure? Frederick Douglass. Tell me something you know about Frederick Douglass. He was a slave in Maryland and escaped slavery as a child. What did he do? This is at the end of his life. You can tell by his hair. What did he do in his life? Does anyone know? You're going to get there in Professor Light's class. But he was a leading abolitionist. He was also an advocate for women's rights as well. The women's rights movement, which is actually not the subject of our topic today, most people identify the start of that as 1848, the famous Seneca Falls Convention. He was a part of that. Does anyone know this lady? But I should say, by the way, these photos are courtesy of the Library of Congress, so you too can go find them for free at any time you like. That's Ida B. Wells Barnett. I mentioned briefly, as I was showing you some pieces of the timeline, that in the 1890s there was a crisis over lynching in this country. Ida B. Wells was the most outspoken, most vocal, and most prolific writer, putting that to light, showing the world that African Americans were being lynched by the thousands all over the South, but in other parts of the country as well. She was actually run out of Memphis, Tennessee, because of her activism in the 1890s and had to relocate to Chicago, where she married Claude Barnett, who ran a black newspaper in that city. Frederick Douglass, though, is known for a lot of different things: abolition, women's rights. He lived a long time. He lived long into the 19th century and was able to transition that piece of American history from slavery to Reconstruction to the period that came next. And again, we are racing through the 19th century. But as we come to the end, we see two other very famous figures. Okay, who's the gentleman on the left who's seated? Anyone know? I see people smiling. I think you've probably seen his face. Okay. That's Booker T. Washington. And how about on the right? He's in profile. No? Okay. W.E.B. Du Bois. Sorry, I didn't realize we had a hand back there. These two gentlemen were probably the most important civil rights figures at the turn of the 20th century. And they had very different approaches to the problem of segregation. I've mentioned a famous court case here at the bottom, Plessy versus Ferguson, again, and you'll get there in Professor Light's class if you haven't yet. In 1896, the Supreme Court ruled that the law of the land that defines segregation was legal. You could have separate public schools for whites and African Americans, separate public accommodations for whites and African Americans. You could divide a train, for example, and say this passenger car is for whites, and that car is for African Americans. All of that segregation, which had been happening anyway, was affirmed in 1896 with that court case. The responses to it from these two gentlemen were very, very different. Booker T. Washington gave a famous speech in Atlanta in the mid-1890s called the Atlanta Compromise, in which he announced his intention to the listening public that if lynching could be stopped, it was essentially a deal with white America. If whites would cease the lynching of black Americans would stop pressing for civil rights and instead would turn their attention inward into improving their own education, their own skills, and someday in the future would then be ready, he thought, for full citizenship. W.B. Du Bois was at the other end of that spectrum. He didn't buy into that at all. He was a Harvard-educated intellectual, the first African American to ever earn a PhD from Harvard University, and he couldn't get a job with that. He was turned down over and over and over and wound up working, I think, at Morehouse or Spelman. Mike, you can check me on that. And was, for many, many years, all the way into the 1950s, a leading voice on civil rights. But where Washington said African Americans need to turn inward and improve themselves and stop pushing for civil rights, Du Bois said, no way. Civil rights must come now. And he thought, in his mind, that there was a small segment of the African American population, of which he was a member, he called them the talented 10th, that would lead everyone else. And the two of them didn't like each other at all. They clashed very publicly on a lot of things for a number of years. But Booker T. Washington died in 1915, and Du Bois continued on to 1960, I believe. He died in his 90s. Very, very different approaches to the problem of segregation, but both advocated civil rights. Now take a look at this. I'm going to guess these are folks, maybe you don't know their names or faces. Du Bois founded a group around 1907 called the Niagara Movement. It was an all-black civil rights group. All of its members were African American. It was not very successful in the beginning, had a hard time attracting attention and money and getting traction. And in 1909, he refashioned it as the NAACP, which continues to this day. The National Association for the Advancement of Colored People. That's what that stands for. Look at these founding members. What can you tell me about them just by looking at them? They're all white. So from the very beginning of the NAACP, and again, this continues to the present day, it's a multiracial, multi-ethnic group. And Du Bois and the people you see here, and others you don't see here, were all part of that effort. They all had an integrationist view of how to advance and improve civil rights. Moorfield Story on the left, the extremely stern-looking person right here, was the first head of the NAACP. It wasn't Du Bois. It was Story. Joel Spingarn is the person for whom the Spingarn Medal is named. That's an award that the NAACP gives to people every year for their outstanding work and service in the field of civil rights. And he's white. Julius Rosenwald was a very wealthy person in Chicago. He was the tycoon from Sears Roebuck. Sears still exists to this day. And a well-known philanthropist who supported black rights in Chicago, in national circles, to the tune of millions and millions and millions of dollars. And then Jane Addams here at the end is probably best known for her work with Hull House. That was a spot in Chicago, a settlement house in Chicago, where poor immigrants, almost all of whom were actually white, could come and learn the language, learn skills, learn how to live in America. She also felt strongly about the plight of African Americans. So what I want you to see here, again, it's a multi-ethnic, multiracial movement from the very beginning. Is this a familiar face to anyone other than myself? I'm going to guess that is not either. This person is neither. Anyone? All right, well, let's see who they are. Okay. On the left is Marcus Garvey. In the late 19-teens and into the early 1920s, Marcus Garvey became something of a celebrity as a civil rights organizer. The UNIA was his group that he founded, Universal Negro Improvement Association. And again, in your African American history class, you'll get there as you move through your course. And Garvey organized millions of African Americans around the country to press for civil rights. He was based in the Northeast, but the groups were all over the country. I'm aware of one in particular in Michigan, in Lansing. There may have been one in Grand Rapids. I'm not aware that there was. There definitely was in Lansing because I know that Malcolm X's father was in it and was actually murdered because he was a member of the UNIA. Garvey took a view different from Du Bois and even different from Booker T. Washington from years before. Garvey was saying to America, and specifically to black America, we have to do for ourselves. Again, kind of an inward look, but it wasn't about withdrawing, it was about building up separate black institutions like schools, universities, banks, businesses. This sort of set the tone for the 1920s when that sort of thing was very, very popular. Black-owned businesses, again, black colleges and universities, black schools, run and developed and excelling by African Americans themselves. It was a movement that sort of spoke about a nationalism for African Americans as African Americans. And to Garvey, part of that included repatriation to West Africa, moving masses of black Americans to West Africa. Now, that didn't actually happen, and he certainly wasn't the first person to suggest that. Way back in the 19th century, many people had said the race problem could be solved by removing black Americans from America. And for a lot of reasons, that was not a very palatable option. But Garvey was talking about this in very concrete terms. He even had his own steamship line that would take people from the United States to Western Africa. And his intention there was not to sort of shake off all the trappings of what was becoming modern American life in the 1920s. His idea was to recreate modern American life with capitalism and democracy and all those things, but to do it in Africa. It turned out that Garvey was a brilliant orator and a very, very smart person who was also a little shaky on his business dealings. The U.S. government actually went after him probably because he was a troublemaker, but there was actually something to it. The Black Star Line, his steamship company, was corrupt. Fraud was perpetrated. People did lose their money. And Garvey was actually deported in the late 1920s. I neglected to mention he's Jamaican. And he was shipped out of the country in the late 1920s by the State Department. This other gentleman on the right is Rube Foster. His real name is Andrew, but he went by Rube. And in the 1920s, Rube Foster did in baseball what Garvey was doing in mass politics. The NNL, the Negro National League, was the professional baseball league that he founded in 1920. There had been other versions of this prior to that, but the Negro National League was the first well-organized, reasonably well-funded and successful venture here. And of course that came from the fact that Major League Baseball would not allow anyone who wasn't white to play. You couldn't be a Detroit Tiger unless you were white. That's a whole long other story. Matter of fact, I gave a version of this presentation a year ago about black baseball in America. But what Foster was doing, again, was taking a page out of the Garvey book. It was black-owned businesses using capital, money, from black banks and black players playing for black audiences. Again, it was somewhat of an internal look, but not a withdrawal, a celebration of, an expression of power, ingenuity, and economic influence through baseball. And the Negro National League sort of went up and down as the years went on. It crashed with the Great Depression and then came back in a slightly different version. And the Negro Leagues continued actually past the point of integration. Major League Baseball integrated in the late 40s, but it went all the way to about 1960. Another funny wrinkle in the story when we look at the 1930s is this. It's the communists. Okay. On the left, in the white man who's wearing a three-piece suit is Sam Leibowitz. Sam Leibowitz was a Jewish attorney from New York who, at the request of the Communist Party of the United States, took on the legal defense of the Scottsboro Boys. The Scottsboro Boys are these teenage boys here. In Scottsboro, Alabama in 1931, the lows of the Great Depression, these boys were riding the rails. They were on trains, trying to get from one town to another, looking for work, whatever they could find. That was something that hundreds of thousands of Americans were doing when the Depression was at its worst. In the course of doing that, they encountered two young white women on their travels who later claimed that they had been raped by these boys. This was in 1931. In the Depression, in Alabama. And the boys were arrested. They were convicted by an all-white jury because in Alabama there was nothing other than an all-white jury. And they were sentenced to death. Never mind that rape was a crime that heinous as it is, didn't carry the death penalty. They didn't do it. And there was abundant evidence that no rape had occurred by them or by anyone else. As a matter of fact, the women who had initially made the charge changed their story and said, actually, no, this didn't happen. But the case didn't end in 1931. As a matter of fact, it rattled on until the early 1950s. Some of these boys became men in jail for no reason. And their case, the NAACP wanted to take on their case, but actually they preferred to go with the Communist Party of the United States, which meant, in addition, they had a white attorney. The communists took interest in the problem of civil rights and the problem of segregation because they saw it as a means to build a socialist paradise, to upend the system of capitalism that underpins all of American life. Their view was that capitalism structured the inequality that created segregation and violations of civil rights. So if you throw that over, then you can build new in the socialist paradise where everyone is equal no matter what their racial or ethnic heritage happens to be. The party did defend them for many, many years, and as I said, it took into the 1950s. The case went to the Supreme Court and back and forth to the state of Alabama. One of them died in prison. It's a terrible, tragic story, but again, it shows us the role of sort of unusual parties in all of this. In this case, the communists. On the right, Lester Rodney. This is sort of a montage photo. Lester Rodney led an effort in the 1930s, again for the Communist Party, to integrate Major League Baseball. And the newspaper of the Communist Party of the United States, which was called the Daily Worker, took this as a primary mission. It looked at baseball as the national pastime, as the quintessential American institution, and said, if we can integrate baseball, then the rest of the country perhaps will integrate. And it turned out that was somewhat true. They weren't able to make it happen, but they took up the cause of the Negro League ball players who were trying to integrate Major League Baseball in the 1930s. And here you see Lester Rodney, who led that work for the Communist Party of the United States. Okay. Moving quickly ahead to the 1940s, Phillip Randolph, James Farmer, and Jackie Robinson are three of the most, important figures from the 40s. In the early 1940s, the world was at war. The United States joined World War II at the end of 1941 and continued to 1945. Black Americans, just like white Americans and Hispanic Americans and Asian Americans, signed up for the military or were drafted by the military and served all over the world, in Asia, in Europe. And while that was happening, the black newspapers, the leading black newspapers in the country, like the Chicago Defender, put together a publicity campaign called Double V, and you'll see that mentioned on your timeline. Victory at home, victory abroad. And it was a way of saying, encapsulating the idea that if black Americans will fight in a world war, and by the way, they fought in segregated units in the Army, Navy, and Marines, if they will do that for America and do it well, as they had in World War I and other wars, then that will help change the problem at home. Victory abroad, victory at home. Show valor and bravery in war, be rewarded for that with integration and civil rights at home. Turned out not to quite happen that way. But as that was going on, Phillip Randolph contacted Franklin Roosevelt, who was the president, and said, look, there's all these wartime jobs going on, all these factories springing up, people need to be employed. Why are these jobs all going to white workers? Why is it so hard for African American men and women to get employed in the war manufacturing economy? Why is that so hard? Roosevelt didn't have a satisfactory answer for that, and Randolph threatened a march on Washington. Now, you may know about Martin Luther King's March on Washington 20 years later. Randolph said he could show 5,000 people who would march, and Roosevelt ignored him. He came back sometime later and said, I've now got 30,000 people who will march on Washington during the war to protest. Nothing from Roosevelt. And when he was able to show that he could muster 100,000 protesters in front of the White House in the middle of World War II, the Roosevelt administration caved. And they built, with Randolph's help, something called the Fair Employment Practices Commission, FEPC. It's a government agency. It's been around for decades. And the purpose of FEPC was to say, in government employment, hiring should be done fairly, whether you're black, white, whatever it is. So Randolph was the one who made that happen. James Farmer, in the middle, was one of the founders of a group called CORE, Congress of Racial Equality. And CORE was, like the NAACP, it was multiracial, multi-ethnic group, founded at the University of Chicago in the early 1940s. And they took on issues of civil rights that later, their techniques, I should say, later became very popular. Sit-ins in the 1940s, marches and what later became known as freedom rides, all happening in the 1940s. But what's interesting, and Farmer was the genesis of this, what's interesting about CORE is that the government responded to CORE's activities by saying, you know, Mr. Farmer, there's a lot of people in CORE who we think are communists. What are you going to do about that? And it's sort of an interesting story of its own. We don't really have time to get into it much here on the struggle between CORE and the U.S. Justice Department about rooting out communists out of its organization. It was sort of an interesting compromise that a civil rights group made in order to get certain things in return, to kick people out of its group at the behest of the Justice Department. And then last, one of my personal heroes, Jackie Robinson, shown here in his Brooklyn Dodgers uniform. Robinson was, in some ways, it's technically true to say, the first African American to play Major League Baseball. If you add in the 20th century to that statement, then it's true. If you don't add that, it's not true. There were blacks playing Major League Baseball in the 19th century. The color line was drawn in baseball in 1884. So from 1884 to 1947, no blacks in Major League Baseball until Jackie Robinson was chosen. And this is sort of an interesting thing to file away in your head for when you get to this part of the African American history course that many of you are taking. Integration, when it happened in the 40s, 50s, and 60s, very often happened at a pace set by white people. Baseball's a good example of that. The Negro Leagues were very well developed in the 1940s. There were lots of teams each with dozens of players. One white team owner, Branch Rickey, the Brooklyn Dodgers, said, I want one black player, and it's this guy. Now, that's a particular dynamic you need to take note of, because there's many other examples of that. Robinson was the first in 1947. He had to make an agreement with the Brooklyn Dodgers that for the first 3 years that he was in the major leagues, he would not react to anything anyone did to him. And people did terrible things to him. He received death threats. He was hit. He was spiked while trying to turn the double play at second base. He was spat upon. He was routinely abused by other players. As a matter of fact, there's one particularly ugly incident where the entire Philadelphia Phillies team from the dugout, led by their manager, heckled him for 9 innings with the most horrible racial slurs you could ever imagine. And his deal was he would turn the other cheek. And that wasn't in his temperament to do that. But as a pioneer, he agreed to do it. Anyway, Robinson, again, one of the early steps towards integration. 1 year after Robinson, President Truman integrated the military, which for all these years had been segregated. Okay. Now we get into the things that probably more and more of you are familiar with, even before you get to this point in your African American history class. Another famous court case, Brown versus the Board of Education. You can see the key pieces of it right there. The Plessy case that I mentioned a little while ago, the case, Supreme Court case from the 1890s that said segregation, separate but equal, is legal. This case overturned that and said no. You can't have public places, public institutions that are segregated. Separate but equal is inherently illegal. That's the key to Brown versus Board. It was a huge victory for the NAACP. You see Thurgood Marshall in the middle there. Very happy in that picture. He was the lead lawyer for the NAACP in getting this case put through. And again, this is sort of not a well-known fact, but Brown versus Board is actually 5 different court cases folded into one. Brown is the best known of those cases. But the NAACP had been working for a number of years on this question of schools. Because schools, public schools, they felt, and I would agree, are a key building block to a democracy. If we don't have strong public schools, what kind of democracy are we going to have? If people don't get educated and cannot function and survive and thrive in our society, they can't be an active part of our democracy. So integration of schools was seen as a huge first step for civil rights and for ending segregation. The thing of it was, the court case, although it was a unanimous decision from the Supreme Court, said that the schools must integrate, quote, with all deliberate speed. That was the phrase, with all deliberate speed. I'm from North Carolina. I grew up in Durham, North Carolina. North Carolina prides itself on being one of the more progressive southern states. That is debatable, by the way. But we pride ourselves on that. The school system that I went to did not integrate until 1970. It's a long time after 1954. And there are many, many examples of that where at the local level, local politicians, business people, and school boards deliberately found ways to drag their feet on the question of integration long after this was the law of the land. So nonetheless, despite that, this was a huge moment for the NAACP, probably the most significant achievement that group has ever had before or since, and it really set the stage for what was going to come next. Unfortunately, what was going to come next was pretty awful. And I mentioned to you when we first started this chat a little while ago that some of the images you're going to see today are disturbing. You're about to see one of them. Emmett Till, just 1 year after the Brown case, Emmett Till was a teenage boy, African American, lived in Chicago, and he went in the summer to visit some family members in Mississippi. And Emmett didn't know the rules of segregation. He lived in Chicago, which has its own issues along segregation, but he didn't know the lay of the land. He didn't understand the things that you couldn't do as a young black man in Mississippi in the 1950s. He and some friends were in a small store. They saw an attractive white woman, and Emmett tried to show off for his friends by whistling at her. That was a bad idea, to say the least. This is Emmett at age 14 before he did that. The woman was outraged at this behavior. She told her husband had been away for the day, and when he came home, she told him what happened and who had done it. He and another person went to Emmett's uncle's house where Emmett was staying, took Emmett Till, and that's the last time anyone ever saw him alive. His body was found, I think within a day or two it was, terribly, terribly mutilated, beaten, shot, castrated, horribly disfigured. A cotton gin fan, something that weighs about 75 pounds, hung around his neck and thrown in the water. And his body was in terrible shape. His mother, of course, was devastated, but his mother in Chicago had a sense of the emerging civil rights movement, and she wanted his funeral to be very, very public. And she insisted on an open casket, and this attracted the national media. So on the left you see Emmett before, and on the right you see Emmett after. It was horrible, absolutely horrible. But Emmett's mother, who wasn't Martin Luther King, she wasn't a high-profile leader, understood the power that this could have. And the reason that we're seeing this terrible photo now is because the national media wasn't there. They live filmed the funeral and photographed it, of course, and this all lives on in the archival record. Again, how do historians know what we know? We have documents that help us to do that. Later that year, in Montgomery, Alabama, a woman who was savvy about the civil rights movement, who was a field secretary for the NAACP in Birmingham, Alabama. There she is. Anyone know her name? Rosa Parks, absolutely. What's Rosa doing in this picture? Right. She's getting booked. Why is she getting booked? There you go. She didn't want to move on the bus. Rosa Parks lived in Birmingham. Later, Martin Luther King described Birmingham as the most segregated, most racist city in the most racist state in the United States. And in Birmingham, as was true in many, many places, city buses were segregated. Seats in the front were for whites, seats in the back were for African Americans. Rosa Parks refused to give up her seat to a white man. That was what the expectation was. She wouldn't do it. And the bus driver called the police and she was arrested. The media sort of portrayed this as she just had enough. She was tired and just didn't want to do it, and she was an accidental hero. I'll tell you as a historian, I'm a little suspicious of that. Because she worked for the NAACP and because they wanted this issue, once Brown versus Board had happened just a year before, they were looking for ways to challenge segregation. This provided it for them. It also launched the career of Martin Luther King. The incident with Rosa Parks occurred in December of 1955, and for the next 11 months, African Americans in the city of Montgomery refused to ride the buses. They would not ride city buses. And this was a technique, a nonviolent technique, that King as you've said before, as a class, all steeped in nonviolence, that King said, here's a way that we can challenge the system without putting ourselves at immediate physical jeopardy, and to do it peacefully. We will not give our money to the city bus line. Won't do it. Won't do it. And, okay, but people still had to get to work. And so African Americans in Montgomery walked miles and miles to work. They developed a system of carpooling. It was an early experience in organizing for Martin Luther King, and it made him a national celebrity. By late 1956, the city of Montgomery, which was running enormous deficits on its city buses because most of its patrons were gone, caved, and they changed the law. They integrated the buses. It was an early success for Martin Luther King. He founded, you'll see the initials here, SCLC, Southern Christian Leadership Conference. That came out of this incident and pressed him forward into the public eye. This is a picture of King from later in life, but he was very young when this happened. He was in his upper 20s when this happened. He even became a national media star right away. Just a year later, not even a year later, in Little Rock, Arkansas, again, the integration of schools was the spark. In Arkansas, the rule of desegregation, the law of desegregation, was going to get tested again by these 9 young people, boys and girls. One of them, her name is Minnie Jean Trickey, was here on campus a year ago talking with students about her experience trying to integrate Little Rock High School. Arkansas wasn't Mississippi, and I can say that as a Southerner. I feel like I've got some credibility on this one. It wasn't Mississippi. It wasn't Alabama. It wasn't Georgia. It was much more moderate than those places. And the governor, you'll see his photo in just a second, the governor of Arkansas had always been seen as a moderate on issues of civil rights and race. He wasn't a rabid racist. But when this group of students working with local organizers decided they would test Brown, all of that changed. It was their right by law to go to Little Rock High School instead of the school for blacks that had been in their school before. It was their right to do that. The law said so. But the people of Little Rock, the white people of Little Rock, didn't want that to happen. And this became an enormous national crisis. By the 1950s, Americans are living in an age of mass media. There's no internet, there's no cell phone, but there is TV, and of course there's film. And people could turn on their sets in their living rooms in Grand Rapids, Michigan, and see chaos in Little Rock, Arkansas, because 9 kids want to go to school. You know, they weren't banging on the courthouse doors for something. They weren't shoving the county clerk trying to get registered to vote. They wanted to go to school, as simple as that. And they had initially the protection of the police. That didn't work. Orville Faubus, what a name, Governor Faubus, took this issue and made it a political windfall. He drew a hard line in the sand and said, you cannot force us to integrate. The Supreme Court can't tell the state of Arkansas or the city of Little Rock what it has to do. That was the line he wanted to take. Absolutely not. It's a states' rights issue. He was defying the law, and again, he made it a political windfall for himself. Again, national media descended. There are other photos I won't share with you today that show outraged mobs of whites, many of them white teenagers, screaming and pushing and kicking these 9 kids, making their lives a living hell in trying to go to school, as simple as that. And Faubus, of course, was in front of the cameras every day. In the end, the crisis was settled when President Eisenhower, never someone who was known as a particular progressive on the question of civil rights, actually mobilized the U.S. Army. And these students, with the Army, tanks, soldiers with guns, were able to go to school when escorted by soldiers. A very, very dramatic moment, but it was, again, an early way of supporting the success of Brown. Shifting a little bit away from the nonviolent tactics, away from the integrationist approach, is the Nation of Islam and its most famous leader, Malcolm X, formerly known as Malcolm Little. I don't have a photo here of Elijah Muhammad. Elijah Muhammad is actually the person who ran the Nation of Islam for many, many, many years and who brought along Malcolm X. But Malcolm X was active in this group from 52 to 64. In 1952, he got out of jail. If you know anything about Malcolm X, then you know early in life he was in and out of jail a lot. He was in trouble with the law for all kinds of things. He found the Nation of Islam while he was in prison, and when he came out, he was installed as a minister. And he worked in a number of different places, including Detroit. But he's probably best known for his work in Harlem. sort of the heart and soul of America's largest African American community. These are the things that Malcolm X was talking about. Different from Martin Luther King. So early on when I showed you Booker T. Washington and W.B. Du Bois, I talked a little bit about the difference in their approach. You can do that again with Martin Luther King and Malcolm X, and we did that just a little when we started our talk. Malcolm X was talking about a sense of nationalism, talking about self-defense from white aggression and white violence, and possibly even separatism. Those were ideas that came not just from his religious beliefs, but from his political beliefs as well. Early in his career, he thought of himself as a Marxist, perhaps a socialist, and that, of course, got the attention of the FBI and the U.S. Justice Department, not in a good way. And he said some things to the media that really, really got picked up. And when I asked you at the beginning, what do you know about Malcolm X, someone in the group here said, oh, violence. And my response then, was not exactly, not necessarily. Self-defense, gaining civil rights by any means necessary doesn't necessarily mean violence. However, Malcolm X did refer to white people as blue-eyed devils. And the media certainly picked that up and ran with that and put it in sharp contrast to what Martin Luther King was saying and doing. When John Kennedy was assassinated in November 1963, a reporter handed a microphone to Malcolm X and said, what do you think about that? Malcolm X said, well, it's the chickens coming home to roost. Right. That really landed him in hot water because, of course, the president had just been murdered in front of a national audience. But also the Nation of Islam had just condemned that murder. And when Malcolm X said that moved him along a path of being on the outs with the Nation of Islam. He and Elijah Muhammad, by 1964, really didn't get along very well. He learned by the early 60s that Elijah Muhammad had many, many children from many, many women, and that seemed to violate what the Nation of Islam was talking about in terms of the way you build and maintain a family. Malcolm X went to Saudi Arabia. He went to Mecca, to the pilgrimage that all these Muslims take, and was very surprised to see Muslims from all over the world who were black, who were white, who were somewhere in between, and really expanded his view. There's a fantastic book about this, The Autobiography of Malcolm X, written by Alex Haley, who did the Roots miniseries in the 1970s, that actually came out after his death. But Malcolm X is pushing a different thread of the movement, certainly from what Martin Luther King was doing. More in the line of what King was doing were the sitters and the writers, as we sometimes call them. On the left, Greensboro, North Carolina, 1960. 4 young African-American students dressed in suits, wearing their Sunday finest, went into the Woolworths, sat down at the lunch counter and said, we'd like some lunch, please. And, of course, they knew they weren't going to get served, because the Woolworths in Greensboro in 1960 would not serve African Americans at the lunch counter. You had to go to the back of the restaurant and take a box lunch and take it away. The counter was for whites. Well, again, I mentioned previously, sit-ins actually began long before 1960. Back in the 40s, CORE was trying this. It was a way of, again, advancing desegregation and saying that everybody gets equal access to public space. They were berated, they were pushed and shoved, people came and dumped garbage on them, but it sparked off a national movement of sit-ins. This was in February of 1960, and by April of 1960 there were black students all over the United States sitting in, simply saying, this is our technique, we're going to come in, we're going to occupy a seat, and you may not serve me, but you're not going to serve anybody else either, because I've got the seat. Again, it was a good sort of a nonviolent technique that Martin Luther King perhaps would have approved of, maybe a little different from Malcolm X. On the right, the Freedom Riders, back to CORE again, the Congress of Racial Equality, very publicly, again, a multiracial group, blacks and whites together, riding on buses, trying to essentially make the point as they drove through the South that integration had to happen. Blacks and whites would sit together on the bus, moving from state to state to state. This was very well publicized. The media followed it. Everyone knew where they were going to be and when. There was a map that was printed and published in newspapers. And in Anniston, Alabama, a white mob met them, pulled them off the bus, put a bomb in the bus, and as you can see it burning there, and beat the riders. And some of them had sustained injuries that they suffered for the rest of their lives for riding the bus. that's it. For riding the bus. At the surface, that's it. But as they knew, and as the white mob knew, it was about challenging segregation, advancing civil rights, equal access for all. We seem to have lost our power here. That's okay. Okay. You may have figured out by now, since we've been doing this for about an hour, the civil rights movement has a lot of alphabet soup. CORE, NAACP, and now here's SNCC, as it was called, SNCC. The sit-ins in Greensboro led to a new group in the South. This group was founded in Raleigh by Ella Baker, who you see at the top. Got together with students and said, what about a civil rights group that isn't high profile like Martin Luther King's SCLC, that doesn't have the same sort of explosive nature that the Nation of Islam had in 1960? What about a student movement, a student-led movement that worked at the grassroots at every individual place where you live? Try to integrate. Voter registration was a big purpose of SNCC. And so students, just like you, got involved in this. And it started in Raleigh, North Carolina, and spread all around the South. And a few years later was very active in Mississippi in particular. The woman at the bottom you see there is Fannie Lou Hamer, who in 1964 became one of the most charismatic figures in SNCC during what we call the Freedom Summer. She's a good example of an everyday person. She was a farm worker, wasn't a college-educated person or didn't work in a law office. She was a farm worker who had suffered under segregation and racism all of her life. SNCC organized her and her abilities and her energy into pressing for civil rights. While this is happening in Mississippi, next door in Alabama, things are a little bit different. Here's Governor George Wallace, who was elected governor in late 62 and took office in early 63. And as he took office, gave a very, very famous speech in which he announced that in Alabama, segregation would be the law of the land. Didn't matter what anybody said, whether it was the Supreme Court, Martin Luther King, SNCC, made no difference. And he actually said to the cameras, in Alabama it would be segregation now, segregation tomorrow, segregation forever. A much thicker accent than I do, though. So really, if you ever actually hear the tape, it's much more powerful. Again, Birmingham and Montgomery and other places were all in Alabama. And in Birmingham in 1963, the civil rights movement exploded. With Governor Wallace, sitting in the governor's chair. There were a lot of terrible things that went on as Martin Luther King brought the movement to Birmingham to try to integrate the city, including a church bombing in September of 63, which 4 African-American girls were killed on a Sunday morning while they were getting ready for church. All of this was in Birmingham. It was enabled by the governor's office, but it was also enabled... All right, it's partially working. There we go. By this man, Bull Connor, who I've always thought looked just like his name. Bull Connor was the police chief of Birmingham, Michigan, and he was an old-fashioned, dyed-in-the-wool segregationist who was not going to have his city integrated by outside agitators. It's the phrase he and others like to use. Bull Connor mobilized the police, as you can see in the picture on the right, to stop protests, to stop marches and demonstrations, and to do it pretty violently. What you see here is the Birmingham Fire Department, BFD, on the back of that guy's jacket, turning the fire hose on the protesters. The protesters were adult men and women and children. And they all got blasted across the streets of Birmingham by Connor's fire hoses. I've never stood in front of a fire hose when it was on. I don't think I would like to. That's an awful lot of water pressure. And that aggression was turned on people who were doing, again, at the surface, nothing more than walking or standing. But below the surface, clearly, They were pressing for change, trying to advance the cause of civil rights, in this case, in the city of Birmingham. In other areas, we have people like William Moore. He was a mailman. He was from Binghamton, New York originally, but relocated to Baltimore in the early 60s so that he could be a little bit closer to the movement. And William Moore took it upon himself to, as the slide says, walk alone from Chattanooga to Jackson. Now, I don't have a map handy, but I can tell you that's about 400 miles. And you see him here with the sandwich board that says End Segregation in America. It's harder to read the bottom, which says black or white, eat at Joe's. Wearing that sandwich board, he walked alone to try. He didn't finish the trip from Chattanooga to Jackson. And again, this was covered in the news. Everyone knew where he was and who he was and what he was doing. And so they killed him. His murderer was not known. Perhaps the Klan, we don't really know. And walking alone in this way was probably not a very wise thing to do. As the movement matured, people learned what the most dangerous activities were. This certainly was one of them. He was shot in the back at night walking alone in Alabama. Again, I want you to see this because most people don't know the story of William Moore at all. But also, here's a middle-aged white guy from upstate New York stopping his life because of the injustices he saw in America. Again, it's a movement of people, all kinds of people from all around the United States who, in some cases, truly put their lives on the line for civil rights. 1963 is a very tough year, but it did end with a high note in Washington. The very, very famous I Have a Dream speech of Martin Luther King addressed hundreds of thousands of people from the Lincoln Memorial and gave perhaps one of the greatest speeches of the 20th century. It's very easy to YouTube, and I would suggest that you do this. When I teach History 250, I always have that in there, to actually hear his words and the way he says what he says, and talks about his children being able to play with white children, and then blacks and whites living together, blacks being judged by the content of their character, not the color of their skin. It's an amazing moment in American history, and this is at the end of 1963. 64 is a little different. A lot of energy in the South, back to Mississippi. But with tragedy as well. The Civil Rights Act, 100 years in the making, is passed in 1964. Martin Luther King directly responsible for helping that happen, and he won the Nobel Peace Prize for getting that done. The Civil Rights Act of 1964 legitimizes all the things that should have been legitimized at the end of the Civil War. That everyone in this country, regardless of their race or ethnicity, has the same access to all facets of American public life. We all do. And it doesn't matter who we are. So that occurs. A year later is the Voting Rights Act, which speaks specifically to voting, since African Americans had been pushed out of the voting booths for decades in the South. This is also the year of the Freedom Summer. Again, here's SNCC, that student group, Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, organizing massive voter registration drives in Mississippi, teaching in what they called freedom schools, teaching young African American children history, English, math, and African American history and literature and poetry. And they were aided in that work by students, and when I say just like you, I mean just like you, leaving Michigan and Ohio and Massachusetts and spending their summer in Mississippi doing this work. By the hundreds, maybe as many as 1,500 college students dropped their summer plans, whatever those may have been, including work, and went to Mississippi to do this work, to organize, to go door to door to door, poor farmers and sharecroppers and say, do you want to register to vote? We can help make that happen. Do you want to participate? And that was very, very risky thing to do. They formed something called the Mississippi Freedom Democratic Party, MFDP, that actually went to the National Democratic Convention in Atlantic City and completely upended Lyndon Johnson, President of the United States, and his plans for that convention. But on the way, 3 civil rights workers who were part of the Freedom Summer disappeared. Goodman, Cheney, and Schwerner. disappeared one night in Philadelphia, Mississippi. They were run off the road, put in jail for a few hours by the local Neshoba County Sheriff. While that was happening, the sheriff had called the Klan, by the way. The Klan got its people together and organized, and then he said, okay, boys, you're free to go. And he sent them back out to drive back to their SNCC headquarters at night on a rural road in Mississippi. And, of course, the Klan was waiting for them and murdered them and hid their bodies. And the FBI came to town, and it took them quite a while to find the bodies. People who knew didn't want to say. It was a national tragedy. One of many national tragedies. But I suspect the reason it got as much attention as it did was because of Mickey Schwerner and Andrew Goodman. White Jews from the Northeast. James Chaney, people like James Chaney were murdered all the time in Mississippi, I'm sorry to say, but not college-educated white guys from the North. And again, the Freedom Summer was very high profile, and it took something like this for the national media to really zero in and expose the horrors of Mississippi in '64. So here's another example of black and white together, this time with tragic results, at the forefront of the movement at the ground level. Okay. And you can, I think it says it all right there, actually. Here we go. The Voting Rights Act, a year after the Civil Rights Act, guarantees the right to vote. But marches continue. Again, this is Alabama, from Selma to Montgomery. And in some ways, it's as though nothing has changed. Because here you see the police gassing and beating the marchers who are trying to get over the Pettus Bridge in Selma, Alabama. It was known as Bloody Sunday. John Lewis, who is in the Congress now, it's a congressman from Georgia, he's been in the Congress for a long, long time, was present and was beaten to the ground at Selma, Alabama in 1965. In February of '65, Malcolm X was assassinated in front of 300 people while on a stage just like this one by rivals from the Nation of Islam who simply stood up, pulled out shotguns, and murdered him and ran out of the building. '65 is a hard year. It's actually not on here except for the mention at the top, but Los Angeles, a section of Los Angeles called Watts, exploded in a very nasty riot in the middle of 1965, a race riot. And so in '66, things are starting to change. It's not that many years from, I Have a Dream, but things are starting to change. Martin Luther King went to Cicero, Illinois. Does anybody know Cicero? Anybody from Illinois? What do you know about Cicero? Yeah, it's a little piece attached to the side of Chicago. Do you know anything about the population in Cicero? Maybe now. Not in the '60s. Cicero was white, working class, ethnic. I think it largely still is to this day. I don't know, I haven't been to Chicago in a while to see for myself. But that was the population in the '60s. And Martin Luther King took the civil rights movement to Chicago. Okay, so not Mississippi at this point, not Georgia, not South Carolina, Chicago. And I'm sorry to say, failed miserably. King was not successful in integrating Cicero at all. There was a very violent reaction in the North to Martin Luther King and the push for civil rights. At the same time, down back in the South, SNCC, which had been a biracial group from the very beginning, essentially removed all white people from the group. A few were allowed to remain, but they could no longer have influence in the group. So most, just knowing that, they went on and did other things. But SNCC became essentially an all-black group, and it laid the foundation for what we call black power. Best example of that is the Black Panther Party, whose initial title was Black Panther Party for Self-Defense. Huey Newton and Bobby Seale were the founders of this in Oakland, California, although, again, its roots are in the Southeast. It took shape in '66 in California. And they were kind of like the Nation of Islam, but without the religious piece. They were separate. They were separatists, and they were militant. And they saw that in the state of California, there was no law about carrying a gun in plain view. So they did. They dressed themselves in black, they wore black sunglasses and berets, and they marched and protested and otherwise demonstrated with military assault rifles and bullets across their chest because they could. That was legal at the time. And of course, they were trying to make a strong statement. They did. They got the attention of the local police, they got the attention of the FBI, and they got the attention of a very special part of the Justice Department, the counterintelligence program, which launched from 1966, first an investigation and then a war. That is really not putting it too strongly. A war against the Black Panther Party. So again, nonviolence comes apart. Martin Luther King was murdered in 1968. Robert Kennedy, we haven't really talked much about him, was also murdered in 1968. He was, at this stage of his life, he was a friend of civil rights. It's debatable whether he was earlier. He certainly was by 68. The Democratic National Convention in 1968 in Chicago exploded in chaos, partly over the civil rights issue. 2 African-American track stars took gold and silver at the Olympics in Mexico City, and as they stood at the medal stand with the national anthem playing and the American flag flying, they each raised one fist in a black glove and bowed their heads, the Black Power salute at the time, and that outraged people in the United States. And then Fred Hampton, who was a leader of the Black Panther Party, was murdered. Again, it was a war between the Black Panthers and the U.S. government. At the top you see Chicago, 1968, where protesters, a large number of them were college students, were summarily harassed and eventually beaten and gassed. There's a very dramatic moment, you could probably find it on YouTube, where the police are beating the students as the students scream, "The world is watching, the world is watching," and it was. The cameras were rolling. And then this is Fred Hampton. Again, this is one of our disturbing images. Fred Hampton, his apartment was, the door was kicked in at about 4 in the morning by the local police. This is Chicago. Everyone inside was gunned down, including his pregnant wife. She did survive, actually, and gave birth to Fred Hampton Jr. Hampton was a charismatic leader of the Black Panther Party, who in particular was interested in some of the social services Black Panthers were doing, like free breakfast for children, free education for black children. So for Hampton, of all people, to be murdered was truly, truly tragic. We're coming to the end of the tale, and we're certainly going to have time for questions. But as we do that, I want to talk a little bit about legacy. I chose to cut this off at 1969. It's a slightly arbitrary decision, not truly. But I do want you to see some of the spillover that comes from the civil rights movement in subsequent years. Certainly the women's movement is a great, great example of that, and you can see that in this top statement. This actually goes back to the mid-19th century. I mentioned at the outset, Frederick Douglass was an active member of the women's movement in the mid-19th century. There's a long story about how these two things wrap around each other. But by the 1960s, particularly things like the Civil Rights Act, gave new energy and new rise to a group called NOW, the National Organization for Women. Drew a lot from the civil rights movement. In some cases, it drew people. You see Polly Murray at the bottom. She was very active in the civil rights movement prior to getting involved with NOW, and there's a lot of other examples of that. In the 1970s, the women's movement had a long and unsuccessful battle to get the Equal Rights Amendment passed. Even that had its roots in about the 1920s, but they tried again in the 70s using techniques learned in the civil rights movement in the 50s and 60s. There's also the American Indian movement, which is, again, a direct descendant of the civil rights movement, AIM, American Indian Movement. You see Dennis Banks and Russell Means there together on the left. Among other things, AIM was involved in armed pitched battles with the United States government. At Wounded Knee, the bottom bullet there in South Dakota, that was a spot where some atrocities had happened to Native Americans in the 19th century. They tried to take that over and wound up in a shootout with the FBI where people were killed. They did march on Washington, the so-called Trail of Broken Treaties, and their march ended at the Bureau of Indian Affairs, which had historically mistreated Native Americans for 150 years. And they occupied Alcatraz Island. If you don't know, Alcatraz Island is in San Francisco Bay. From the city of San Francisco, you can see it's not very far at all. It's right there. There used to be a famous prison there, but it's also cherished ground for Native Americans. And they occupied Alcatraz and held it for over a year. Last, let me mention the United Farm Workers and Cesar Chavez, who again, he predates the civil rights movement in some ways and raps over it in some other ways, but a lot of the things that he did for farm workers, most of whom were Mexican immigrants, very, very similar to the kinds of things that parts of the civil rights movement were doing boycotts, protests, for example. The boycott on California grape growers went on for years in the 1960s, and that was to get higher wages and better conditions for the people who picked those grapes. Similar things were launched against lettuce growers and other large-scale producers of fruit and vegetables. Those things continued into the 1980s, and Chavez actually has a presence in Michigan. If you go into the Michigan State Library, there's a large oil painting of Chavez commemorating the work he did with Mexican immigrants working as farm laborers here up in the north. And I want to leave off with these things, and maybe this will prompt us for a couple of questions too from you. What are the issues of today? How are they related to the past? And I'd be very curious to hear from you, what's your view of this? What are the big civil rights problems now? And then do you see any linkages to what you're learning about here?
As we take questions or comments from you folks, we have a couple microphones. We'd like to bring those around so everyone can hear and so it can also be recorded. I'm going to ask Dean Olson, he doesn't know that, to help with the logistics of this. So I'm going to hand him a microphone, and I'll take one. And any questions you might have, we'll come around and hand this off to you. Don't be shy.
Let me ask you this. If you're, well, go ahead. Go ahead. I see a hand. Go right ahead.
Hold on, I'm sick right now.
Sorry to hear that.
I don't think that like people who get in trouble with the law like should really have to lose their rights, civil rights for voting and everything. I know they're in trouble, but I still think they should be able to vote. Mm-hmm. You know. Mm-hmm. So. Okay. What would an example be that you would say would be an infraction of civil rights? I'm thinking of one now. We're in, shortly after the attack on the Twin Towers, 9/11. What would you say?
Wiretapping.
Certainly wiretapping, absolutely. Wiretapping without someone's knowledge. For all you know, we're being tapped right now. Right? But what else?
Along the same lines, a lot of the Patriot Act.
Okay, which did what? Or does what?
That's okay.
It limits or it watches certain activities.
Mm-hmm.
It has a lot to do with proving your identity and being a U.S. citizen.
Right.
To be here.
Right. In airports, shortly after the attack in 2001, what did airports and airport security companies do immediately in the aftermath to try to prevent such a thing from happening again? Right there in the airport, yeah. Go ahead.
They started profiling.
Yeah, and what is that?
Basically just judging somebody by what they look like.
Their looks, their clothes, maybe the sound of their voice if they speak with an accent. And of course, this particular example is a reference to people of Arabic descent, because of course the hijackers were Arabic. But there are a lot of other much more concrete examples. Go ahead.
Like just gathering the people up and sending them to Guantanamo Bay, just holding them without any trial or anything like that.
Sure, certainly a violation of civil rights, and that is something that happened to African American protesters, particularly in the South in the 50s and 60s. Thrown in jail, no due process, even though everyone's entitled to that. What are some other issues? These are some just sort of high-profile ones, but I bet there are some others. Yeah.
Could you argue that the healthcare problem is also a civil rights problem, since it seems like more minorities don't have access to it?
Yes. Yes, you could. Healthcare is a very good example of that. A lot of people, I heard Kwesi Mfume some years ago, he's the current head or former head of NAACP, speak about healthcare as a civil right. And I think you've brought out a very good one there. Healthcare typically is something that if you don't have insurance, you probably don't have the money in your pocket to pay for expensive health care either. And when you look at the demographics of who doesn't have insurance, people of color are disproportionately represented in that group. And that, of course, isn't fair. What about public education? I see Dean Olson nodding vigorously over there. Yeah, go ahead.
I was actually going to comment about that.
Yeah.
Affirmative action, like a lot of people said that affirmative action was reverse discrimination.
Mm-hmm. How do you feel about that? Okay, why not?
I feel I don't think that African Americans have the kind of advantages that other minorities have had as far as education and things like that.
Mm-hmm.
And I think for our nation to kind of like recognize that, I think that's kind of their way of saying I'm sorry. I don't think it's reverse discrimination. I think they're just kind of trying to make up for the past.
Okay. How about the question of schools? Again, let me push that point just a little bit more. I'll give a little structure to it. Maybe that'll help us. Public schools are funded in an interesting way. It doesn't work this way in a lot of other countries, but it does work this way here. There's money from the state, of course, that helps a school operate. And I'm talking about K-12 here just for the moment, just for clarification. But there's also the property taxes that the people in a community pay that generates money for the school to use. Okay? Knowing that, I see Professor Light is dying to jump in.
I'm just going to tell them they're actually taking a test where one of the questions on the exam this week regards that very issue, right? We've talked about this quite a bit.
All right. Go ahead. Take it on.
Well, since they used to do redlining back in the days.
Which is what?
Segregating housing.
Yes.
And so African Americans started with less equity, property.
Right.
So schools just don't benefit the same. They don't get the same textbooks. They don't get the same number of teachers.
Right. Good. Very good. Even 50 years after the law of the land desegregated public schools, we have community-based funding for our schools. So if your area that feeds a particular school doesn't have a strong property tax base, you're not producing a lot of money through taxes for that school. Knowing that, if you look at old practices like redlining, which is now illegal, where African Americans were not allowed to buy or rent property in certain parts of American cities, creates ghettos. Again, it all feeds the same place. It doesn't generate enough revenue for good quality schooling, and the people who live in that district are disproportionately people of color. So again, even now, that's a current civil rights issue that gets tied back to residential discrimination. Historians like to always say, there's a great book, ... and there is, about this very thing. It's called American Apartheid. Massey and Denton co-wrote that one. And it's all about that the very conscious process of creating residential segregation, which then has a serious ripple effect, including public schools.
Yeah, and we've talked about this before, right? We don't need a book to figure that out either. All we have to do is look around our own neighborhoods, right?
Absolutely. Any more? I'd be happy to take one more. I see we're running out of time.
How about, I'm going to steal it just for a second.
Go ahead.
Dr. Lerner. I wonder, there's sort of a theme in a lot of the presentations that are developing this week, especially with a couple of our keynotes around the idea of the election of President Obama, and is this the end of the struggles? And it strikes me watching what you put together for us today, so much of this was about access, and we talked about the segregation and the fact that we still seem to live in a segregated society. Where would you, as a historian, how would you evaluate the election of President Obama? Has it changed anything, and if so, what?
It's earth-shattering to me. And I say that as not just as a historian, but someone who was raised in the American South. I'm actually proud of us as a country to have done this. I think it's a remarkable moment. We are all living in a historic moment. I hope that he turns out to be a great president. I think that remains to be seen. He's brand new in the job, hasn't even finished the first 100 days. But that we could elect a person of color to the highest office in the land to be the so-called leader of the free world is amazing to me. I think it speaks very well about the potentiality for the future. But that said, there's realities that we all are living with. At the moment where the country's gripped in an economic crisis, Grand Rapids has a lot of trouble, and certainly the state of Michigan has many, many problems that don't have an easy resolution. They're economic and they're social, both. Is it the end? No, I don't think it is, but I think it's a really, really positive step for the future. And I'm glad you mentioned that about a theme emerging for the week. If you don't take anything away from this other than one statement, please let it be this. My theme, in case it wasn't already clear, is that this is about you. people, me, all of us, what we do or don't do shapes the way it is. So to sit back and say, can't do anything about it means, right, you can't. You have to get involved in things. Pick your battles, find the things that interest you, be a student, be a parent, work, do all those things, but, and maybe this is a tie back to Obama who gave everyone this charge, you cannot afford to sit by the sidelines and let other people decide this stuff for you. You have to do it. Whatever your interests are, you have to do it. No one will do it for you.
Okay, 2 tasks before we go. I would like everyone, if you did not get a chance to pick up an evaluation form on your way in, please do so we can assess the validity of this symposium for next year and years beyond. It takes 2 minutes to fill out, so if you didn't get one, they're on the table out front. If you filled one out already, or if you're in the process of filling it out, you can just place the filled out form back on the table as you exit. The other thing we need to do is to give Dr. Lerner one more round of applause for a fantastic presentation.
Thank you. Thanks very much.
Thank you so much, guys, for coming.